Just got to make sure that the firewall security on those things is good.
Yeah, no
Don't
kidding.
need anybody hacking into my heart.
It actually is scary how hackable a lot of medical technology is.
Well, I know pacemakers already got hacked and ransomed.
Yeah, they're super easy. Yeah, there's
crazy. Yeah, that needs to be solved first, and then we start rolling out the organs.
Hello and welcome to Entropy Rising, where we talk about science and futurism. I'm your host, Jacob, and as always, I am joined with my wonderful co-host, Lucas. Lucas, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful, Jake. Thank you for asking. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. So today we have a topic that I think will interest everybody, which is the idea of life extension. I think we all want to live longer. At least we think about it. You know, you see it a lot in a lot of different stories, mythology, and even science fiction. I think a good way to start off is why don't we define what we consider to be life extension, because it is a broad definition depending on how you do it, and dive a little bit into how we might even be able to achieve it.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So when I think of life extension, there's several different means of doing that. You can be extending your life by, preserving yourself or freezing yourself for an extended period of time to extend your life, but really just extend the period of time that you can exist in.
Yeah.
Where when I think of real life extension, it's keeping you alive for longer against not just your natural age, but against disease and, different traumas and things like that.
I agree. It's funny you mentioned the cryopreserving one. Have you ever read Hyperion?
Yeah.
That's a plot point in that book. Some people periodically freeze themselves so that they can live over a longer period of time, even though their lifespan isn't necessarily longer than anyone else's. They can see the centuries more.
Right. And I would consider that life extension.
I think so. But, at least for me, I'm more interested in having a longer life from my perspective. I would like to see the future, of course, but I also would like to experience more time.
Yeah. You'd like to experience everything between then and now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Life extension is such an interesting topic because in a lot of ways, we have life extension technology now. It's not as flashy as what we have in science fiction. But when you think about it, better cancer therapies, even antibiotics could be considered life extension.
That's a crazy thought.
Yeah, something as simple as insulin is life extension for many people. Oh, and organ transplants and anti-rejection drugs. These are all things that are extending the average lifespan.
Yeah, I guess really when you think about it, it really is, right? Because what was the average lifespan of a human being 300 years ago? Like 35?
Yeah, especially because infant mortality was the biggest thing that brought down the average lifespan.
Right. But still, it's like I said, it's really about getting that average up.
Yeah.
Right. Being able to go in there and save all of these, even infants or people with diseases that we've now even eradicated. That really does play a huge role in the first steps of being able to live hundreds of years.
Absolutely. I've read one of the fastest growing age groups in most first world countries is centenarians, people living to be 100 plus years old. Because, like I said, we have all these life extension technologies. And if you're able to increase the average lifespan, even by a couple of years, the outliers, you see those grow a lot more. And that's really what we're talking about with this type of stuff. So I know it's presented most of the time as like this crazy science fiction concept, life extension. We could live forever, and we'll talk about more extreme versions of it, of course. But in many ways, it is something we have.
Yeah, it is great to acknowledge that we do have that already. But when I think of life extension, and when a lot of people do, it is the science fiction way, right? It's we're living, like you said, for hundreds of years, but also not as elderly people who are waiting for death, right? Because I don't want to be 200 if I look 200.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's the difference between lifespan and health span. So, lifespan is, of course, how long you live. Like you said, living to be 200. And then health span is how long are you healthy for those years.
Mm-hmm.
The average life of someone now is around 80, 86, something like that, I think.
In the United States, I think it's a little lower.
That's
I
crazy.
think it's like 74.
So the average lifespan of a person might be 74 years old, but the average health span of a person might be closer to like 65, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, those last, especially 5 years, tend to be not so great. So not only do we need to increase lifespan, but we have to increase health span as well, or else nobody's going to want to live to be 200 and some like,
Dude, that would be crazy. Most people have hip problems in their 50s. Yeah. Imagine how bad that would be.
Yeah. So absolutely, we have to increase health span as well as lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
And I do tend to, in my mind, imagine with life extension, it's going to be almost like taking your current lifespan and elongating it. So I tend to imagine if you're going to live for 200 years, your middle ages, instead of being 10 or 20 years, might now be 40 years of time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Hopefully they won't do childhood much longer though. You remember how awful that was when you were like 16 and you're like, "Man, I cannot wait to be able to get my license or just go outside and do adult stuff." But instead of 16 years, it's 40.
That is going to be something we're definitely going to talk to when we get to the how this will shape civilization part of the
Mhm.
conversation. But it is an interesting thought because I don't think that necessarily because you're going to be living longer that your childhood and adolescent stages are going to be much longer. Now, you might consider someone who's 40 or 50 years old to still be juvenile because they haven't had as much life experience as someone who's like 500 years old.
Right.
But developmentally, they're still a full grown adult.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, like I said, the childhood and the adolescent stage, those are clear marked developmental milestones where once you pass 20, 25, you're fully developed. So at that point, it really is just psychological aspects of age more than it is physiological ones.
Yeah. Okay. So when you think of life extension, do you think that's going to be like something that's going to allow us to be immortal?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's two kind of types of immortal, right?
Mhm.
There's this idea of immortality with capital I, which is you live forever and you're almost impervious to damage and you're just going to live forever no matter what. And then there's this softer definition of immortality known as biological immortality, which says we've arrested all disease, we've arrested all aging, but you can still be shot, right? You can still have a car accident. So you're not going to live forever, but you will live a very long time until some accident takes you out.
Yeah. Okay. See, but when I think about that, right, and where you are still a fragile human, you just could go on forever. But if we have the technology to allow for you to go on forever, I feel like the odds of you dying from serious wounds would be much lower. It'd almost be like you're a vampire and they have to cut off your head and burn it in a fire.
Yeah, you're not wrong because, like you said, if you have the medical technology to extend life, I mean, at this point, you're regenerating organs. You might even be going into the cells and repairing the DNA at that level. So,
Hmm.
like you said, you do have the technology to preserve life in the event of tragedies even more. It reminds me of Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space series. One of the scenes in that book that I thought were really interesting was the spacesuits were actually fitted with mini guillotines. And the idea was that you could wear a collar like around your shirt made out of cloth.
Hmm.
And in the event of a depressurization, it would cut your head off and form a bubble to preserve your head with the idea that they can just recover your head and grow you a new body because your brain's the only thing that matters. That's the only thing they can't recreate. They can make a whole new body for you, but once the information in your brain is lost, you're gone. They can't recover that.
That sounds ridiculous now, but if we had gene therapy like down to a science and we could do cloning like that and just clone a body ready to receive a head, there's no reason why that wouldn't work.
Yeah, that's exactly how they did it. And they took it a step further. They even had AI so that you could potentially have an AI who shadows you and basically becomes you. That is a way you could exist into the digital realm after you die, which is another way that you can have life extension, of course, is through mind uploading. And that
Mhm.
gives you more of the like capital I immortality. You can live on forever. Or even with that, you're not living forever, right? Eventually the universe will end. We think it'll end with the heat death. That's the current popular notion. So,
Yeah.
but you're talking about hundreds of trillions of years of life at that point.
Yeah, just like unfathomable amounts of time. And one day the computer will just turn off.
Yeah, at that point, I'm just going to say you're immortal. There's no point in splitting hairs of, well, you're only living a couple 100 trillion years.
Yeah, if you're outliving the universe and all that's left is like minuscule black holes, then yeah, I mean, you're essentially a god at that point.
Yeah, I think immortal is a safe term for that.
Absolutely.
So, thinking about life extension, we've defined it a little bit, we've talked about it, but where are we in the realm of this right now?
Well, like you said, we have antibiotics and cancer therapies that we're using right now for it, but we do have a lot of exciting technology on the forefront that is specifically for extending life. A big one that I love to talk about is micro robots, nanobots.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That can be taken by pill. Some of them are already in use. You take a pill, it monitors your vital signs, things like that. They're not perfect, of
Yeah.
course.
And I don't think those are on the nanoscale quite yet, right? I
No,
wouldn't
no, no,
imagine.
they aren't, but they are small
Yeah.
robots that you intertwine with your body. But they do also have nanobots that react to certain chemicals that
Yeah.
are able to move. They're not able to structure anything yet, but if those can be perfected and run through your entire body, they could repair cellular structures. They could help increase cognitive ability. They can scan you for any kind of illnesses. They can fight off viruses, boost your immune system. They will make you live longer.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's undoubtable.
And then also in sort of like a realm of robotics is prosthetics. Now we have prosthetic organs,
Mhm.
right, that are not developed yet, but they are a theory, right? And they are being put into practice. People are developing things like that, like artificial hearts and artificial kidneys are two of the biggest
Yeah.
things that are being created. If we can perfect that, imagine that you never have to sit on a waiting list again.
That would be huge. I read this statement from like a world-renowned transplant doctor, and he said, one of the saddest things about doing organ transplant for kids
Mhm.
is there's just not enough organs available because kids tend to live nowadays,
Yeah.
which is good. I'm glad that the lifespan of kids and infant mortality is not a thing, but it does mean that there's not organs available for transplant.
Yeah, I mean, like it's great that most kids are living, but wouldn't it be nice if all of them could?
Yeah, if we could grow
Right?
these organs, right, you don't have to wait for a tragic event for one person to save the life of another.
It really is gruesome, and of course, it's the best that we can do right now. I think that one day soon that will change, and that's going to be an amazing thing.
I think so. I've stumbled across a bunch of different papers saying that 3D printed organs are growing really fast. This seems to be a very promising field of research. Seems like breakthroughs are happening almost every day. And I read actually just recently there was a guy who was discharged from the hospital with a fully artificial heart. That those are becoming much more common now.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. Think about what we've already been using:
Yeah.
pacemakers, stents. These are artificial sections
Hmm.
of organs. So the fact that there is somebody out there right now living with an artificial heart does not surprise me at
Yeah.
all.
Really, the only limiting factor that we've had with artificial hearts for the past 20 or so years, the actual mechanics of the heart is fairly easy. It's mostly just a pump. It's the power, right? I remember in the early 2000s watching a documentary of a guy who had an artificial heart and he had to carry around basically a car battery. And it got him like 8 hours of charge. And he was like, literally, if this battery dies, so do I.
He's like Tony Stark, man.
Yeah,
He needs an arc
he
reactor in
does.
his
Yeah.
chest.
But I absolutely agree with you. I think artificial organs are going to be one of the largest breakthroughs we have in terms of life extension. Once we're able to regenerate hearts, kidneys, livers, all of these other things, that's
Mhm.
going to be huge. I think that's going to be the biggest breakthrough we make that we might see, honestly, not that long away. I'm not going to put a timeline on it because not my field of expertise, but within our lives for sure, with maybe even within the next few decades.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that we'll be seeing it within the next few decades. Just got to make sure that the firewall security on those things is good.
Yeah, no
Don't need
kidding.
anybody hacking into my heart.
It actually is scary how hackable a lot of medical technology is. I
Well, I know
saw
pacemakers already got hacked and ransomed.
Yeah, they're super
That's
easy. Yeah,
it's
there's like
crazy.
no one even thought that someone would want to hack these, and they have to be accessible by network so that doctors can reprogram them if needed. So
Mhm.
anyone with like a flipper zero can turn off your pacemaker, jack up your heart rate, which is terrifying.
Yeah, that needs to be solved first, and then we start rolling out the organs. But yeah, so what are some things that you think would influence life extension?
You mentioned the idea of nanobots, and I really think in terms of life extension, that would be the biggest one that might allow us to live to near biological immortality. Because at that point, you can really just replace the cellular mechanisms that wear down over time
Mhm.
and regenerate the body at a cellular level, even going so far as to regenerate DNA. DNA polymerase, which is what goes through and copies your DNA and also has a bunch of repair mechanisms. It's between 10 and 14 nanometers in size. And so that's within the nanoscale. If we can build an artificial version of DNA polymerase that has better error checking or maybe even error correction, if you can program this nanorobotic DNA polymerase molecule and have it go and scan your DNA with a high level of fidelity and fix those problems, we really don't know how long you'd be able to live at that point if we could just always keep your DNA up to date and in check.
Well, I mean, realistically, and of course, debate me if you think that I'm wrong, but if we could do that, that would be like you were saying, immortality until unfortunate cause of death.
I think it would be very close to it. There are some other systems in your body that would need to be tackled. One of them is mitochondria have their own repair mechanisms and systems. and they're more susceptible to damage because there's a lot of oxidative stress within the mitochondria.
Mhm.
So they're more susceptible to wearing down over time. But I think that would actually be maybe even an easier problem to tackle than completely synthesizing your own DNA polymerase.
Yeah.
But if you can do that, you can also presumably go through and repair the mitochondrial DNA as well.
Yeah, like we've already figured that out at that point,
Yeah,
right? If
I
we're
think you
doing
would.
DNA
Yeah.
therapy.
And then you also have to tackle the issue of cells that don't regenerate, something like neurons.
Mhm.
I think the best thing to do, if you have the technology, just replace or regrow neurons one at a time as they degrade in such a way that, kind of like a ship of Theseus, you're not replacing every neuron in your brain at once. But if you're just replacing them and repairing them and maintaining them as they age and wear out, then yeah, I think at that point you're nearing biological immortality.
Yeah, because if you can replace neurons like that, then they can just slowly form new natural
No,
connections. You would never notice a difference.
you wouldn't, yeah. I mean, like I said, I can't remember what episode I brought this up in, but replacing a couple of neurons here and there is no different than you getting a mild concussion in terms of are you the same person in that philosophical debate.
Yeah, it's just putting another stick of RAM in your computer.
Yeah.
It's still the same computer.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit better.
So I definitely think if you could get down to the nanoscale and have
Mhm.
true mastery of nanotechnology, at that point, I think, yeah, you've got biological immortality for so many different reasons.
Yeah, I definitely agree with
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think that brings us into the next segment of this really easily, which is okay, we figured out biological immortality. People are
Right.
living into hundreds of years, thousands of years, maybe forever. So, what does that do to civilization, right? How do you have a civilization where people are living indefinitely? What does that do to people?
Well, let's think about where we would be as a civilization at that point, right? Because if we had that today, let's just say we snapped our fingers and everybody could live forever
All right.
right now, that would be bad
Okay. I'm
because
listening.
people are still going to have kids. We don't have any kind of laws in place and we only have so much earth,
Yeah.
right? And especially like the resources, most people realistically already live in famine and in hard times because there's not enough to go around or we don't have the logistics set up to do it.
I was going to say there is enough to go around, but we are not distributing it to
Yeah.
everyone, which I
But
don't think is going to change with immortality.
no, exactly. Like just because everybody can live to forever now, people aren't going to be like, "Oh man, let's send more over there." Right? It just doesn't make sense. People will still starve to death. Now it'll just be even worse because they instead of missing out on 50 years, they missed out on 500.
Or, yeah, even worse, one of the concerns with any type of immortality or life extension is only the rich will be able to access it, which is very
Mhm.
probable in the beginning.
Yeah.
But even if you imagine a little bit further down the line, maybe it's spread out a little bit. So it's not just accessible to the 1%, but it might still only be accessible to developed countries. So now not only do you have developing countries that don't have access to the same medicine as you, but now the people's lifespans are dramatically shorter. And there's huge ethical ramifications of that.
There really is. It's I don't know. It just seems so surreal.
Yeah, it's also a concern even in developed countries because if this technology comes out, let's go back to your example. Let's say this technology comes out today. There is a new wonder treatment that says you can live forever and it's $1 million. That's just not accessible to a lot of people. It doesn't matter how bad a lot of people want it. That's just not accessible.
Yeah.
So now you're going to end up with this class of people who can live forever. And even so, what if it's not $1 million? What if it's $1 billion?
Yeah. See, now I was gonna say with the $1 million, you might see like an increase of people really grinding out those first 100 years so that they could afford to then live 5 times as long. But when you make it $1 billion, that is a goal that is unachievable by most ever.
Yeah. Because
Right?
$1 million in a lifetime in a developed country is doable. Many
Yes,
people
absolutely.
retire on more than that, even with middle class jobs. But $1 billion, you're not ever getting that.
No, only maybe 100 people on Earth.
Yeah. It's even worse because you have compounding interest, right? So not only are the rich people living longer, but they have longer time to accumulate more wealth and more money.
Yeah, see, that's another part. Like, there will be no more money left. All the vaults will be filled with everybody's money. And then one day, like, it's just like with the universe dying, it'll eventually all just be gone.
I do wonder how that's going to change not only the idea of wealth accumulation, because you will have a problem of people just hoarding money. I mean, we have that problem now, and
Yeah.
people are only living to be almost 100. Imagine if people are going to live to be 1,000. Imagine being born, new person in a world where there are people who are 600 years old and just stockpiling wealth, and you're trying to compete and work your way up that ladder.
Yeah, man. Just like sitting in corporate, just waiting for your promotion. It's just like, how old is Bob again? Bob's only 300. You got another 300 years to go. It's like, oh my God, before you get a chance. It really does create an environment that I feel like would not be enjoyable.
Yeah, it is a huge concern because I'm trying to imagine a situation where you would still have the opportunities that we have now without having to rely on the people at the top dying. And one, I guess, possibility is people might choose to change careers every now and then just because they get bored. I mean, how long do you really want to be the CEO of a company? If you're living 1,000 years, you might do it long enough to get a head start in your savings and have a lot of money. But surely after a few hundred years, that's got to get boring at some point.
Yeah. And assuming that we're still just living on Earth, like that's plenty of time to see quite literally everything.
Yeah.
So you could serve your 100 years first, go out, travel the entire world, and then what?
Yeah. So this is actually why I think if you have life extension technology to this scale, I do think that expansion into the solar system and into the galaxy as a whole becomes a lot more achievable. We had an interstellar colonization episode a little while ago, and one of the points we brought up for why would people want to colonize is because if you have life extension, there might not be opportunities on Earth anymore.
Hmm.
Or it might be the case that you have to wait 600 or 700 years to work your way up the corporate ladder, or you can take a 300-year journey to a new solar system and be one of the founders of a new colony.
Yeah. Get your, own little piece of land for free, start something over,
Yeah.
use you and your army of drones.
So maybe in this situation, you have colonization of the wider universe that works like this. You have a developed country where it's stagnant because all of the people have worked their way up to the top and people are living an incredibly long time. That inspires people to leave that world to go colonize new worlds.
Hmm.
People stay on that world and work at it and build it until it also reaches that point and then they move on.
Yeah. But that gives purpose
Yeah.
throughout your entire life, which is, I feel like most people would opt in for that option. And that's why expanding into the universe and life extension would be such a good combination of technology for humanity.
I always do tend to think about them going hand in hand because it's just hard for me to imagine a situation where we have the technology to go to another star, but we haven't cracked life extension to at least a certain extent. Maybe not immortality, but hundreds of years. But I do want to cycle back to a little bit more of a down to earth scenario, if you will,
Okay, yeah.
literally, and just talk a little bit about how maybe the economics of life extension will work. I know we were talking a little bit about wealth accumulation and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But how does that work with retirement? Do you just work forever or do you take a step back and maybe take many retirements here and there?
Well, that's a great question. Are people still degrading, but just at a much slower rate?
I mean, it just depends on the technology. Let's
Yeah,
for
like
this say no. People are healthy. Maybe they're living 1,000 years, and 800 of those are nice and healthy.
okay, but then the other 200 they start to degrade, or is it like they get to live in almost the same body for 1,000 years, and then they're just like, okay, you got your 1,000 years, time to let somebody else live.
I don't know. That would be more like a yeah. Maybe you could see that all age capped by law.
Yeah, because if we see that, then what is the need for retirement? You build your own retirement, you have thousands of years to work for it. So if you want to go out and travel the world and live the last 200 years of your life because you know that it's on a clock instead of just, I'm getting old, then you can take the effort to plan for that properly before that time comes. And you can live out those last 200 years, assuming that the economy is set up in a way that is fair as it is right now.
Actually, that brings up a good point, which is one of the ways that our lives are modeled right now is you're born, you go to school, you acquire skills, you then use those skills in a trade to acquire money so that when you're older and not able to work as well, you can live comfortably and retire.
Hmm.
Life extension kind of flips that on its head. You might decide, screw that. I'm going to go and have fun while I'm young. Maybe I'll spend the first 100 years of my life doing whatever I want because I have time after that to acquire wealth and to work. It doesn't matter if I start working when I'm 20 or 200 because I'll be healthy.
Yeah. But then how do you get the money?
That is true too. Well, actually, it's also worth pointing out that with compounding interest, if you throw $20 in a bank account at 5% interest in 200 years, you've got quite a bit of money.
I feel like that would have to be reworked.
That's got to change. Yeah.
Because everybody would just be throwing
Yeah.
100 in a year. And then, 800 years down the line, they're multi-billionaires.
Especially, yeah, especially if you have like cryogenics, you can freeze yourself. Just throw $20 in, right, and freeze yourself for 500 years and come out a millionaire.
Dude, I would do that.
Yeah, just skip the hard part. But no, I don't think that could work. In my opinion, I think you're going to see interest rates and returns on investments be proportional to the average age of humans.
They would have to be.
I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens to work out that if you invest money in the market your whole life, it gives you just enough to retire on. Because economies are built for humans by humans, and I think it would be the same thing here. Right now, the S&P, you're talking about 7 to 10% annual yields, and people are happy with that. If you're living to be 1,000, you might be like, oh, wow, I'm getting 0.1% return on this investment. This will pay off in 300 years. This is going to be something.
Yeah. It really would have to be like that because you don't want to completely restructure. Like if they were to make it so that you just get paid less, so that you could invest less, that wouldn't make sense
Yeah.
because that shifts the entire economy. It would have to be in the interest rate, like you said.
Yeah, you could definitely see that. Or just people willing to take the long term on investments more.
Hmm.
Or maybe economies just completely disintegrate and we go to a post scarcity system of everyone just gets everything they need. That would be the nice one, right?
Oh, yeah, of course. And we can assume that is a possibility if we're in this era of space expansion and
Yeah.
life extension. But we got to work with what we know is right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So I definitely think we'll see like economies and stuff like that restructure. You know what else I think might restructure a little bit and be an interesting one too is the idea of religion.
Okay. That is interesting now that you mention it.
I just feel like a lot of religion is driven by fear of death.
Yeah.
And there is a phenomenon that proximity to death drives people to become religious, whether it's from a terminal disease or just because they're getting older and they're staring down the barrel of,
Or
the-
witnessing death.
or witnessing death, any
going
of
through.
that.
Yep.
It can drive people to become religious. And so I think if you take that away, if there is no proximity of death, if people are under this notion that they're immortal, you might see either religion decline or restructure itself over something different.
Yeah. If there is no longer an afterlife that
Mm.
you're going to, it removes that check and balance system that religions have.
Yeah.
Right. But those morals and those values that people pull from religion and that countries have been founded on for their own religions, those might maintain. So it might become more of a community center type of thing
Yeah.
where people share ideas instead of praising a deity.
Yeah. Or, diving into it because of this promise of an afterlife. What's the point of that if you're going to be living forever anyways?
Mhm.
It might not be as strong of a motivator for many people, although there are tons of people who are religious and believe in their religions because they believe it. So I don't think religion's ever going to go anywhere. But I wouldn't be surprised to find that people either become less religious overall, or maybe you see a shift where there's an increase in religion over time. It's also interesting to think about it too, because when you're talking about lifespans in orders of thousands of years, Christianity, for example, is only 2,000 years old. So it's very possible you're going to have people who are as old as the religions are at some point. You've got a religion that's 6,000 years old and individuals that are 4,000 years old. They themselves might be associated with that. Imagine a pope, for example, who's 4,000 years old. They themselves could be looked at as almost like a deity at that point. Which, to be fair, if we have biological immortality, you still might have the fear of death motivating a lot of religions anyways. So
Mhm.
you might not see these go away either. People might still lean into it.
Absolutely.
So tying into that a little bit too, branching out not just religion, but culture as a whole. If
Mhm.
you have people who are alive for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, do you think that's going to cause some stagnation in the culture?
It definitely seems like it would, right? Because culture evolves with people. It's the whole reason why music doesn't sound as good to you and me as it does to the kids of nowadays.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing for us with our parents. Things change and shift, and the people who disagree with them leave this plane of existence, and the people, who are bringing those into light, and the cycle repeats, but it evolves. What happens when the people that we see as our elders that we respect as, members of the society, your grandfather who is 800 years old, who still looks as young as you do and has been through all of this stuff and achieved all of this success, you will probably be swayed to inherit more of his original culture than you would to go and express your own.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Since there are more older people than younger people, presumably at this point, that
Mhm.
culture has more staying power.
Yeah. And not to say that it won't evolve, it'll probably just evolve over a larger area. So it could not be a bad thing, or it could be a stagnation.
Here's my thought about it. A lot of times when you're thinking about elderly people, a usual response to that is, yeah, they're old, just leave them be. Just be nice to grandma. Yeah, she's stuck in her ways. But I wonder if with life extension that people aren't going to have that attitude. You know, if you're living to be thousands of years old and you run into somebody who's 2 or 300 years old and they're stuck in their ways, so to speak, you might say, yeah, oh, well, get over it. You need to adapt to the times. And in this way, civilization and culture might come to value people who can change with the times and adapt and reflect what current society is doing and really shun and look down on people who refuse to change. And that could actually, I think, be a large insult you levy on somebody is saying they're stuck in their ways or they're not changing. Because this would have to be a civilization defined on adaptation if you're living this long.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Especially if, you're moving quickly through technology. People can't be stuck in the old ways because they quite literally can't function in a new society that is moving so quickly through technology. So, I definitely think that is a possibility as well. But culture has many facets to it, right? So, just accepting certain things or getting with the times, you can still do that while taking on the culture of your ancestors the same way that we do now.
It is true. And I do wonder how it's going to reframe our thinking of things like traditions and culture when the people who develop those traditions are still alive today, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the things we consider traditional might only be a few hundred years old. But to us, that's a long time. So, oh, this is a tradition, it's sacred. But if you can say this is traditional and be like, oh yeah, Bob invented that, yeah,
Bob just pops up from the back. Hey.
Yeah, I was. He's like, I got a little drunk. I did this thing, and people started doing it. And
Well, that is definitely something that has to do with death. Is there are a lot of things that gain merit
Mhm.
because of death.
That is true. That's the whole point of a martyr.
Yeah, a martyr, famous artists who have works that they do because of death. Like you said, people who create traditions, stories, things like that gain value and they evolve over time because the people who originally created them died. So it's the new people that are able to make their own perception about whatever it is, turn it into a little bit of themselves and then pass that on.
Yeah. And how many things are traditional because the original reason we were doing it is lost?
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. The biggest one that I can think of is Thanksgiving for me. Like that food needs to be better. I understand that it's traditional. It's got to go.
Yeah. Or even imagine this, if it's traditional, but the person who founded that tradition, who started doing it, is no longer doing it at this point in time, then the tradition, I think, really does start to lose its power at that point.
Oh, you mean like if they're still alive and not doing it?
Imagine the pilgrims who founded Thanksgiving or whatever. You look over at them and they're like, oh, we don't do that anymore. We're so sick of that food.
Yeah, sorry. We don't do that anymore.
So traditions might really start to lose their staying power.
Yeah, see, but that also brings like some solace because tradition is something that inherits a lot of nostalgia and brings together families and friends and things like that. And it's usually centered around something happy, right? When you have tradition or like a coming of life moment. So I don't know, it could be a good thing because a lot of these things are outdated and some of them do need to go, but a lot of them hold a lot of merit to people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think while we're talking about tradition and law and governments, another one that might be fun to think about is how would you think this would change like crime and punishment?
That is a good question because what is a life sentence at this point? And what is the value of a life if you were to take it?
Yeah.
Because we are taking so many potential years of their life from them. And when we go into now, you just killed a person who's 100 years old, but they had 2,000 years left to live. Do you now go to prison for the rest of your life, which is 2,000 years? How do we maintain a prison system like that? And I don't know what that would look like. That would be insane. Because a person, you would think, given thousands of years, they could reform.
Yeah, reform at that point really could mean something.
Think about you live multiple lifetimes paying and repenting for the crime that you did. You're not nearly the same person mentally that you were 100 years ago, right? So that creates a very strong ethical issue, I feel like, because you did steal thousands of years from a person, but at the same time, the person who did that is no longer you.
Yeah, but even thinking about smaller crimes too, if you go and steal a bunch of stuff or maybe do a bunch of property damage, some crime like that where no one's harmed, how long should that follow you for? Are you just going to be stuck with that for thousands of years? Or maybe you just rely on people forgetting over 1,000 years?
Maybe in the beginning, we could go off of like a lifetime clause, right? Oh, he did vandalism and we would have charged him with keeping this on his record for the rest of his life. But maybe we take it off when his expected death would have been at that point. because he'd be a very different person at that point. Then you also have people who get handed out multiple life sentences.
Well, I was also, yeah, I was going to bring that up. A life sentence has a definition. It's usually like 40 or 50 years or something like that, is how it's typically defined as, which is why sometimes you see people get handed down 6 or 7 life sentences. So, what happens, right? Imagine we crack immortality today, and you've got somebody who is handed 150 years in prison as a life sentence, and they say, actually, I'll take that immortality drug. Thank you very much. And now you have this heinous, horrible person who's going to outsmart the system because they're going to outlive their at what one point was considered a life sentence.
Yeah, it's hard, right? Because again, you think about it, like this guy's going to be in there for 150 years. He's not going to be the same guy,
No.
especially if they have some kind of correctional ability going on in there. Or we could do prison in a different way where we put their mind into some kind of a, like you're saying, like a matryoshka brain, put them in there, make them serve their sentence over the course of a couple minutes.
There's a Black Mirror episode about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that would reasonably be the most ethical thing, because when you take someone's life that early on, you're taking several different people's lives, the different people that
Yeah.
they will be over the course of their lifetime.
But that also does bring up the point, people who are serving life sentences now, if we were to develop life extension technology, do we just tell them, yeah, too bad, you can take this life extension and stay in jail forever? Or sorry, you don't get access to this drug because you've been given life in prison? Or do we say, okay, you can have access to this drug and we'll have to redefine your sentence to be some finite time, because life in prison doesn't really work for an immortal being.
Realistically, let's say that somebody was serving out a prison sentence and you were like, I'm going to give you a drug that lets you live 2,000 years, and you have a 200-year prison sentence. The way that you perceive time is based off of how long you're going to live, right?
And how many new experiences you get during that time.
Exactly. So you're putting somebody in there and you're saying, okay, now you're going to be in here for essentially what is now your juvenile life. You have all this other life to live, but you're serving 200 years of it. That could be like a form of torture.
Oh, absolutely. Also, I just don't see the point. 200 years in prison just seems absurd. If you can't reform somebody in 10 or 20 years, I don't think you're going to be able to reform them in 200 years.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you're gonna make a person who only remembers the walls of prison, and when you let them out, it's gonna be, unless you did a really good job letting them like reacclimate to the normal world, it would be like taking a giraffe and putting it in the streets of New York. It's not gonna know what it wants to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And yeah, I think we would have to fully rethink our criminal justice system if we had lifespans this long, because the idea of incarceration, I think, just starts to break down at this level.
Absolutely. It really does. There would have to be other things set in place other than just having people wait a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's about all I have to say about this. How about you?
Yeah. No, I've really enjoyed this topic. This has been so cool to talk about.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And I wanted to give a special thank you to our first Patreon subscriber. I was actually shocked that we got somebody supporting our show so early.
Yeah, it's so awesome. Thank you so much.
It means so much to us, not just the financial support, but the fact that you like our show enough that you're willing to give us financial support. It's just crazy to me. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around that people really enjoy our show that much. So seriously, thank you so much.
Yeah, for giving your time for our time.
Yes. Well, everyone, have a great rest of your day.
See you, everybody.